Welcome to the Rapport Advantage Podcast, transforming the way leaders communicate. Here's your host, Alex Swire-Clark.
Welcome to the show. Welcome to the show, everybody. I'm excited. We got a special guest today. Not going to tell you who it is yet. Welcome to the Rapport Advantage Podcast. If you haven't listened to our podcast before, we are here to help you break down the walls of miscommunication, increase your emotional intelligence, and build better relationships in the workplace and beyond. Our special guest today is Kwame Christian. He is with the American Negotiation Institute, and we are very, very fired up to hear his thoughts on negotiation. So, Kwame, how are you today, bud?
Hey, doing great. How are you, Al?
Doing super. Fantastic. Sun is finally shining down here in South Carolina, so cannot complain a bit.
Oh, man. So you're rubbing it in my face. I'm here in Columbus in March, and so it's exactly how you would anticipate.
Yes. My sister-in-law is up there in March, up in that area of the country. It's, 60 degrees, and then snow. 8 inches expected. Lock down the doors, so it's spring is a violent transition for y'all up there. It's kind of mild down here, but anyway. It's all gravy on the train. So, again, welcome. Thanks for being here today. And so negotiation is what you do. You've got a TEDx Dayton talk that people can go listen to on your website. Really, really phenomenal insights into that. So I've got a couple questions on negotiation in specific areas. So first one coming out of the gate is for our sales folks out there. And in terms of Brian Tracy always talks about 7 steps of sales, and we talk about building rapport on my podcast, kind of step 2, and you're down there towards the end in number 6, where we're talking about closing the sale. So from the art of negotiation, in terms of how to close the sale, can you give us some tips on some best practices maybe?
Absolutely. The first thing I would say that we need to do is we need to be inquisitive. And I know a lot of people, for a lot of people, this is counterintuitive, but I'm sure listeners of your show are pretty familiar with this. But it is necessary to be inquisitive, to be curious. And the thing is that my rule of thumb is that you can't convince anybody of anything. You have to create an atmosphere that allows them to persuade themselves. And the way I do it is by asking a lot of questions, primarily focusing on open-ended questions and what I call open-ended statements. So those are requests for information that don't necessarily end in a question mark. So open-ended questions are questions that start with who, what, where, when, why. And open-ended statements are things like, tell me more about blank, help me understand blank. And the goal is to keep them talking, because if they're talking, that they are becoming more comfortable and they feel like they're in control, but you're the one directing the conversation to the place where it's most productive, and you're getting more information. And then you could use that information to be more persuasive. And
we talk about on our show using our powers of negotiation, using our powers of personality understanding for good as opposed to evil. And so what would you say to people who would say, well, Alex, you and Kwame are just trying to manipulate people, because I'm always like, well, yeah, man, I'm trying to meet folks where they are and get to a positive end for both parties. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And I really have a love-hate relationship with the term manipulation. I think about manipulation more like the way that a chiropractor would think about the term manipulation, where it's just being able to move somebody's pliable perspectives in a way that's more productive. I think it's more helpful if you kind of add another word, a bit of a modifier to manipulation to be more clear. It's either positive manipulation or negative manipulation. So positive manipulation, that's what we're talking about. Negative manipulation, that's what you go to, you see the Disney movies where the villain does all sorts of sneaky, nefarious things. That's the bad kind of manipulation, and that's not what we're talking about here. So it's just really about being able to change people's perspective in a transparent way, in an honest way, and a way that is not intended to do them harm.
That's right. Yeah, you get in those Disney movies and you end up with these evil laughs. Like, no, make it stop. So excellent. Great point. I'm glad you made that clarification, that distinction, because that's a fight that I fight all the time, and I'm sure that you do in your scenario, which we're trying to, help folks help themselves, but we got to lead them down the path to make them, see all of the aspects of what we're trying to get them to understand. So super. So let's go into any really industry / occupation, and that is trying to negotiate a salary increase or maybe some added benefits. So what would be some good tips or rules of thumb to think about when you're going to the boss and saying, look, man, I deserve 10K more a year. I'm doing this, I'm doing this, I'm doing this. And so what's the best way to handle that?
Good deal. And there's an important distinction: the salary negotiation that occurs if you are trying to get a job, and the salary negotiation that occurs if you already have a job and you're trying to advance. So if you are already within the organization and you're trying to advance, then you have a little bit more understanding of the situation. And in that case, I would be more comfortable making an affirmative, clear offer. Like you said, I think I deserve $10,000 more. I would like this benefit, this new title, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas if you're in a situation where you're on the outside looking in that case, I take a more defensive stance and I let the other party make the first offer. And my rule of thumb is, if you know more about the situation, or you feel competent about the level of information and knowledge you have of the situation, the context, then you can make the first offer. But if you're on the outside looking in, you have a dearth of information. So you sit back and let them make the first offer, because you know how bad you would feel if you come into the negotiation and say, I would like $80,000. And they're like, sure, that works. So you never want to have that feeling, because then you kind of ask yourself, man, what could they have given? Because I undersold myself. But now, to your question, if you're already in the organization and you're making a request, first, take it in steps. I don't recommend going into a conversation and kind of ambushing your manager by saying, all right, I'd like $10,000 more, just kind of out of nowhere. Again, negotiation is an information game. Be curious. And so talk to your manager about how they feel about your performance and what things they'd like to see you doing, and what positive things they've seen you do over the past 6 months to a year. Collect that information, and then you can use and create a negotiation strategy. Let them know you'd like to have a follow-up conversation about your role in the company and potential advancement, and then come up with a solid offer, and then start the conversation from there. But I think it's an important first step to slow down, get the requisite information, and then having a second conversation to implement the negotiation strategy you create from that information.
That's such a great point in terms of, you go in there and you're the first to open your mouth and you say, I want $80,000. They say yes. Then it's kind of like we got chirping crickets going on. Like, okay, well, thanks. And you're walking out the door going, oh, man, no, I could have gotten so much more out of that conversation. Or they are setting my value at a level that maybe I was underselling myself, possibly.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And so you want to make sure that you have enough information to be competent in the negotiation. And I just assume in most situations, if you're on the outside looking in, you just don't have it. They will always have more information about their company than you do.
So how do you go about the counter to that? So let's say that you play your cards right and you let your immediate boss or whomever's in charge of making that decision say, okay, well, we think you're worth 75 or whatever that happens to be. What are the steps that you go through to make an effective counter from a timing standpoint, from the language that's used?
This is a great question. And it's really important to recognize that in this situation, context matters. In another business negotiation, the cultural norms might dictate that you can go back and forth for weeks, months, and almost indefinitely until the deal naturally dies. But within the negotiation, the employment context in negotiation, it's a little bit different. From the HR professionals that I've talked to, that I've had on my podcast, Negotiate Anything, they said that you usually get 2 shots. And if you take 3, they start to feel like you're being disrespectful. And so it might be your offer of, I think I'm worth $80,000. And then they say, oh, okay, well, we appreciate that you're at $62,000 now. We can put you up to $72,000. And then this is where you counter. The counter that I like to use in this situation is it's non-offensive and it's intentional, because I don't want to create a situation where the other person is feeling pressure, because if somebody is scared or feeling some kind of negative emotion, they'll go with the safest answer, and no is typically the safest answer. And so this is a question that you can utilize in almost every negotiation, from business to personal. And it's simply, what flexibility do you have? I like that question because, of course, it's an open-ended question. Secondly, it assumes that there is flexibility. And thirdly, it's non-threatening. It's really hard to get offended if somebody simply asks you, what flexibility do you have? And I'd give them time. If you do this in person, it might be difficult for them to do these calculations in their head just off the fly. But if you send this via email and simply say, what flexibility do you have? It gives them time to calculate, talk to people on their team, and come up with a counter. And so it essentially invites them to negotiate against themselves, because technically it's your turn to say another concrete number. So you said 80, they said 72. Now you're asking them to adjust by this question. And one last thing, I have a freebie.
Look out, freebies.
Yeah.
We like that.
That's right. So actually, it's within the Ultimate Negotiation Guide. So this is a 19-page guide that talks about the qualities of effective negotiators, and it has our 3 most popular negotiation guides. The Everyday Negotiation Guide you can use for business and personal, the Salary Negotiation Guide, which is what we're talking about now, and the Conflict Management Guide. And so if you just go to AmericanNegotiationInstitute.com/guide, you can download that ultimate guide with all of those guides that'll take you through a systematic approach to preparing for these conversations.
That is excellent. That is excellent. My only follow-up question to that is, so we're in that room and we have the chance to let them make an offer, and we don't want to come back and counter immediately. How do we get out of the room with posture to be able to then come back with an email and ask the flexibility question?
That's good. That's a great question. And one of the things that I like to do with my teaching of negotiation with my coaching clients and at these presentations is to be intentional about taking as much pressure off of ourselves as possible. And the way that we do this is by giving ourselves time. And so I would go in with almost like rehearsed, I don't want to say rehearsed, but knowing exactly how you want to exit the conversation, what type of things you want to say. Because sometimes you're in that awkward transition position where it's like, I want to leave, but how do I leave? You can't just say, okay, bye, and then leave. And they're like, that guy's weird. Let's not give him a raise. So here's what I suggest doing in that situation. If you come up, you give your offer, they said, maybe we could do 72. It's like, okay, thank you. I genuinely appreciate that. How about this? Let me go home and think about it. I have to talk this over with my family, see what works best for us. And then maybe we could follow this up tomorrow, 10 a.m. Does that work? Cool. Okay. Good deal. But the thing we have to remember with negotiation is that they can't negotiate by themselves. They need you to negotiate. So if you want to end the negotiation ends. If you want to continue the conversation, as long as they're still talking, the negotiation continues. So don't feel pressured to make a decision, because a lot of these time pressures that people put on us during these negotiations are fictional. And so you just need to stand firm and say, this makes sense. It's a really great offer, but I just want to run some numbers, talk it over with my wife, and then we can continue the conversation later, or I'll follow up with an email.
Yeah, awesome. And in this case, you hate to use a cliche, but it does take 2 to tango. And so, if there's not a definite cutoff point, then you just keep on trucking, I suppose. So that's awesome.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So let's talk a little bit about conflict in an organization. Again, this is something on our podcast we talk about quite a bit. So from manager to subordinate to in between the leadership team members, maybe guys on the management level, there's always conflict everywhere. What kind of tips do you offer to companies to best resolve conflict depending on where they are?
The way I look at conflict is like this. I see conflict as essentially a negotiation with attitude. And so what we need to do is first remove the attitude, and then we have a negotiation. Because typically under the conflict, there is a substantive request. And once we can remove the negative emotions that are getting in the way, that are clouding everybody's judgment, then we can address the substantive request, and we can do that using the fundamentals and principles of negotiation and persuasion. So objective number 1 when it comes to conflict is removing the negative emotions. I was reading this book earlier this year called How to Talk So Children Would Listen and Listen So Children Would Talk. And one of the things they say is that you need to acknowledge the emotions of your children. And they say you don't immediately deny what they request or their issues, because you know the right answer. So for example, my son, he wakes up, I take him to the I take him to daycare every morning. And so he wakes up every morning and requests the people that he loves more than me. So that's usually mom or grandma. And I have to say, okay, Kai, mommy's not here right now. Then he starts to cry. He's like, I want mommy. And so what I used to do is say, mommy's not here. I'm all you got. Let's get dressed. I just want to get dressed.
Shoot it straight, baby. Shoot it straight.
Exactly. I was like, these are simply facts. What are we talking about? And so after reading the book, I realized, no, his emotions are legitimate and you need to acknowledge them and let him know that he's been heard. So he says, I want mommy. And I said, okay, Kai, you love mommy, don't you? You want to spend time with mommy, don't you? You want to hug mommy right now. And so every time I say something that's spot on, that demonstrates that I am acknowledging his emotion, that I understand what he's feeling, he says, yeah. And then as he says yes, and he recognizes that I respect his desire and the emotions he's feeling, he slowly begins to calm down. And then we can go to the substance, which is brushing your teeth and getting clothes on. And I think that's a really good example, because when it comes to adult conversations, a lot of times when you are cognizant of the fact that people just want to be seen and acknowledged, and you give them that, sometimes their substantive request will magically disappear, because really what it was an emotional issue that was hidden behind a substantive request. And even if it's not, if the substantive request is legitimate and they do want that thing, now we can actually negotiate on a level playing field and address those issues in an adult, nuanced type of way that serves both parties.
So what you tell me is, as a manager speaking to a subordinate, that
shut up
is probably not going to be an answer that's going to qualify for, okay, yeah, that's momentum. Hey, yeah, okay, my motivators are met. Woo!
Exactly. No. You have to actually listen. And what makes it so uncomfortable is the fact that a lot of times they'll hide emotions behind an intellectual type of approach. I know I do this. I start to get really cerebral. It's like, Kwame is hiding something deep down in his soul, and he doesn't want to let people know that he's hurting. And so it's not always obvious when somebody's being emotional, because somebody might hide it behind, they might see themselves as an intellectual and they won't want to even show the emotion. And so that's where you need to use a bit of curiosity and ask those questions to address it, because sometimes they might not even show it. The term that I use in this case, and it's a term that I mentioned in my TEDx talk, what is compassionate curiosity. And because a lot of times in these conversations, we don't know what to say. We might be taken aback, and we might not be comfortable with emotion. And so where do we go? And so I use this term not in a with a rigid structure, but if you think about somebody who's compassionate, ask yourself, what would that person ask in this situation, and do it. So Alex, let's play a little game. I do this with so many people, and it's crazy the answer that I get all the time. If you were to think of somebody in the world or in history who was compassionate, what name comes to mind?
Mother Teresa.
Exactly. Everybody. I talk to people in different countries and ask them that same question, and everybody across the globe says Mother Teresa. So really, the test for this is pretty simple. In order to utilize compassionate curiosity, just ask yourself, what open-ended question would Mother Teresa ask in this situation? And then let that guide you. And it's incredible how instructive that can be, because it adjusts your tone, it adjusts your focus, and it causes you to focus on the needs, both emotional and substantive, of the other person. And it's incredible how powerful and oddly effective that can be in the most heated of situations.
Yeah, you mentioned some people aren't necessarily comfortable handling other people's emotions. We talk about that in our podcast about our dominant style personalities. When we talk about personality styles, they have a really hard time dealing with our S's, our supportive but yet kind. They're more reserved personality styles, but they have a lot of emotion, a lot of feeling, a lot of care. And the dominant styles are always about, I'm not interested in your story, just land your plane. We got stuff to do. So being able to recognize and realize that is a great point, Kwame, because you have to meet people where they are, not necessarily where you're coming from.
Exactly. And if you are one of those dominant styles, I think transparency is important in negotiation. If you're one of those dominant styles and you're having to kind of navigate the minefield of somebody else's emotions, I would just tell them straight up, like, listen, it is not in my personality to be very emotionally aware. So if at any time in this conversation I come off as cold or callous, please know that it's not intentional. I'm trying my best to connect with you on this level, but it just doesn't come naturally to me. So you're going to have to help me along as well. And the reason I do things like that is because it gives you a little bit of grace. So if somebody's reading something and they don't know exactly how to read it and they're feeling negative emotions, they're going to their cognitive bias is going to interpret the ambiguity against you. And so if I'm if I'm hungry, if I'm sleepy, if I'm feeling cold and I have my arms crossed, I let people know, I'm sorry, please ignore my body language right now. I'm just cold. And I don't want you to think that this is a response in response to something you did. Because if you don't say that, people will assume the worst.
That is so insightful. Ding, golden nugget, people. Did y'all get a hold of that? I mean, if you didn't, you missed it. That was awesome. Okay, Kwame, we got to let you off the hook here and let you out of here in just a second. But my final question, and this is the all-important question, that is, how do we use negotiations when it comes to that onerous task that we all hate? Well, some of us love it, but most of us can't stand to have it done, and that is, we're going to buy that car, man. We're going to buy that car, and we got to talk to the sales guy. The sales guy. So talk to me about what are some great tips, and I know you got a bunch for handling those situations.
Perfect. Okay, shameless plug. I have a 3-part car negotiation series on the podcast where I take people through the process of first doing the research. Second, I talked to my friend whose father was a car dealer and who just bought a car about the negotiation with the car dealer, the sales manager. And then in the third episode, it was a recorded negotiation that I did with a dealership, like an actual one, and was showing people how it's done. Here's what I'd start with. First, I do the research, figure out the car that you want, all the specs, and then identify maybe 3 to 5 dealerships that have the car that's in a competitive range. I would call the dealer with the lowest price and say, listen, I'm in talks with about 5 other dealerships and I don't have much time. So here's the deal. I'm calling everybody and asking what the very best offer is. And it's not, I'm not interested in really negotiating here. I just want to know what your best offer is. And I'll make a decision from that. And so it's a bit of game theory because they don't know what the other person is going to offer, but they know they have one shot. And so then you get everybody's lowest offer. And so you keep track. Okay, so now what are the 2 lowest offers? Now I'm going to have them bid against themselves. And so you can then kind of pit them against each other, say, oh, well, Buyers Subaru up on the north side, they offered me this car for $13,000. You can see it on the website. It's there. Can you compete with that? Once you spark that competitive gene in them, you're going to start to see the prices fall. But here's the thing. Timing is really important. And so what you want to do is you want to pay attention to a few things. You want to buy the car later in the month because they have sales quotas that they're trying to hit. Their numbers are going to be calculated at the end of the month. So they're going to be more likely to push product regardless of the price toward the end of the month. That's the first thing. Their slow days are in the middle of the week. So Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday are typically slower than the rest. If you get towards the end of the day, they start to get hungry for a deal. So they're going to capitulate a lot more toward the end of the day. And if it is raining, then it's worse weather. So fewer people are out buying cars. So they're going to want more sales. So they're going to be more willing to drop their price. So if you listen to the episode that I recorded with the negotiation, they already lowered their price earlier in the day. It happened to be a Wednesday. It was the last day of the month and it was raining and I called at 6 p.m. And so they just collapsed. It was fantastic. So those are a few things you want to keep in mind when you're in your next car negotiation.
That is tremendous stuff. Kwame, I cannot thank you enough for your time today. It's been awesome. Tons of good nuggets here for our listeners. We really appreciate it so much. If folks want to get in touch with you and listen to the Negotiate Anything podcast or bring you in for a negotiation team training or something like that, how can folks get in touch with you?
Yeah, so check out the AmericanNegotiationInstitute.com website that has all the information there. Also, check out the TED Talk. It's called Finding Confidence in Conflict. And anybody who connects with me on LinkedIn gets a personal message directly from me. So I pay attention to everybody that connects. And that was a promise that's become harder and harder to keep as the podcast has been growing. I remember earlier this year, I had, I think, 240 requests. And I was like, oh my gosh, I promised everybody would get a message. And they did. Eventually they did. So connect with me on LinkedIn and we can actually have a conversation, because I love chatting with the people who appreciate the work. And really, I ask for suggestions, and the suggestions that people give me really inform the content. So please reach out. And if there are requests, I'm like a negotiation DJ. I want to play the greatest hits. So let me know.
That sounds awesome. And with the podcast being as popular as it is, trying to maintain those one-to-one contacts is difficult. I mean, you've got over 200,000 downloads. Exactly. The popularity has been really a huge success, and that is so, so awesome. Again, thank you so much for spending the time with us today. We appreciate it. For that, we will say bye for now, and thanks so much.
Hey, my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Alex.
Thanks for listening to the Rapport Advantage podcast. We'd love to hear from you. Join the conversation on Facebook at the Rapport Advantage and follow us on Twitter at Rapport Podcast.